Today we're going to talk about why exes always seem to come back into the picture right when you moved on from them and are actually happy. Now, I'm of the belief that most exes fall victim to something called the phantom ex concept. So given enough time where you weren't threatening their independence, they begin to paint you as this great lost love, which in turn makes them want to re-explore things with you. Now, there's actually a lot to dive in here with, so I want to be economical with our time together. Here's a list of things that we're going to be covering in this video. Number one, we're going to talk a little bit about the avoidant nostalgia loop. Then, obviously, we're going to talk about the phantom ex syndrome. And then finally, the narcissist debate. Let's get down to business. So for anyone who knows me, you would know that anytime I write an article or film a video on a topic, I actually like to base it on some form of psychological research or study. That's where our recent research on avoidance comes into play. Now, according to a poll in our private Facebook support group, over 70% of our clients say they believe that their exes are avoidants. Now, where this becomes interesting really revolves around our history of noticing that avoidant exes have a tendency to come back later. In fact, one of our coaches even mentioned that it's within an avoidance makeup to come back later. You see, according to an article and a video I did a couple of months ago called Why Does a Fearful Avoidant Pull Away, or the stages a fearful avoidant will go through after a breakup, there's 5 distinct stages that you're going to expect them to go through. So first, they're going to avoid all things about the other person. So usually they'll break up with you and then they completely drop you and avoid you. Then feelings begin to kind of surface for them. Then the pendulum begins swinging. They're fighting, some nostalgic feelings, and then they're pushing that away and trying to say, no, I don't want my ex back. Then they actually attempt to move on, and then they fall victim to the nostalgia loop. And it's that nostalgia loop that's of particular interest to our discussion here. Now, I've noticed this nostalgia phenomenon as far back as one of our very first podcast episodes, in which a listener called in asking why is it that their ex always seemed to come back into the picture when they were happy, when they had their own life. Well, assuming your ex is an avoidant, they can fall victim to what's known as a nostalgia loop. A bit of background on this. Now, generally speaking, we found that after a breakup, someone with an avoidant attachment style won't begin missing you until a combination of 3 things happen. You've moved on from the breakup, they moved on from the breakup, and a lot of time has passed. And it all harkens back to this contradiction that all avoidants seem to be fighting. See, all avoidants, they want to fall in love, but they refuse to let anyone close enough for that to actually happen. So in other words, their ideal partner is one that they can fantasize about without the actual threat of an actual commitment taking place. And that's where the foundation for the phantom ex comes in. Now, I've talked a lot about the phantom ex syndrome on my website, on my podcast, and on this YouTube channel. Now, in my opinion, it's probably the single best explanation for why an ex will come back when you're happy. Now, quoting from freetoattach.com, in my opinion, one of the best websites revolving around avoidance, an avoidant person often has a story of a perfect ex in a relationship that wasn't fully realized. The one that got away, to whom no one else can measure up. In reality, the idealized relationship was often lackluster, insecure, and unlikely to be highly functional. So we have 2 avoidant makeups combining here, the nostalgia loop and the phantom ex syndrome. And here's what I've really noticed occurs. Once time goes by, they begin to move on. You begin to move on. You find happiness. Your ex falls victim to nostalgia. They begin to cast you as a phantom ex, and then they try to rekindle. Now, one of the things you'll learn about avoidants in general is they are often trapped in a prison of their own making when it comes to relationships. And this is weirdly by design. They're natural lone wolves. And so they actually prefer to self-sabotage their relationships. Yet the trickiest part about this is that most often they aren't aware that they're doing this. They just do it. It actually has a lot in common with the pattern we've noticed narcissistic individuals fall into. And that's really where the avoidant and narcissistic debate comes into play. Now, when researching what I really wanted to talk about for this video, I kept coming across individuals stating that exes who came back when you were happy tended to be narcissists. Now, there wasn't any real research done on this. I just went to Reddit forums and love forums, and consistently you would see, oh, your ex is coming back because they're a narcissist. And I want to really make one thing clear. Narcissists and avoidance are 2 entirely different things, but there is kind of an interesting overlap. So up right now, I'm going to put a graphic by Sir Thrive Tribe. They put together this really great graphic really talking about the narcissistic abuse cycle and how there's 4 stages to it. The first stage is idealize. So it's a phase of immense flattery, gifts, and excessive attention to appeal to your heart, weaken your defense mechanisms, and allow you to be drawn into a whirlwind romance without even realizing it. Next, they devalue you. So admiration begins to cease to exist, and it's replaced with verbal and emotional abuse. This phase is characterized by cruel, degrading, and condescending remarks, often disguised as jokes and sarcasm. Victims feel confused, doubt themselves, and develop low self-esteem, which leads right into stage 3 of the abuse cycle, which is the discard stage. Now, this is where the victim's usefulness to the abuser has ceased. The abuser has found a new supply, someone to replace the victim to fulfill all their needs. The victim is tormented and thrown away as if the love shared between them never existed, which leads into the 4th stage, the Hoover stage. The narcissist attempts to draw a victim back into an abusive relationship by any means necessary, begging, crying, guilt-tripping, projecting, blame shifting, etc. And then, boom, the idealized stage happens again, and around it goes. Now, this cycle has a lot in common with our avoidant relationship death wheel that I'm so fond of posting all over our YouTube channel and our website, of which there are 8 stages. You know, the avoidant wants someone to love them. They found someone. Their troubles are over. They notice some worrying things in the relationship. They self-sabotage. They begin to think about leaving. They actually leave the relationship. They're so happy they left. They start to feel kind of lonely. Why can't I ever find the right person? I want someone to love me. Boom, boom, boom. Around and around we go. If you aren't familiar with this, this is essentially the entire life cycle of a relationship from an avoidance perspective. But I thought it would be kind of fun to color code the actual avoidant death wheel and just show you how much it overlaps with the narcissistic chart. So if you actually, I'm going to throw it up on the screen right now. If you actually look, and this is really fun to do. If you actually look at the Sir Thrive Tribe graphic where they're talking about the narcissistic abuse cycle, you'll notice they've color-coded each of the 4 stages of narcissistic abuse: the idealized stage, the devalue stage, the discard stage, and the Hoover stage. The idealized stage is kind of like this weird pale pink color, then devalues like sort of the pink color. But I think for right now, we're just going to talk about the stages: idealize, devalue, discard, Hoover. And what I've done is I'm actually going to throw it up on the screen. I've color-coded the avoidant death wheel to show you which of the 4 stages it falls into the narcissistic sort of abuse cycle. So the stages 1 and 2 of our avoidant death wheel fall into what's known as the idealized stage. So I want someone to love me. I found someone. My troubles are over. This is where the ex will often give you a bunch of flattery, gifts, excessive attention, appeal to your heart, weaken your defense mechanisms. That's all the idealized stage. Stages 3 and 4, the I'm noticing some worrying things or I'm thinking of leading, fall into the devalue stage. So their admiration is now ceasing. They're not necessarily going to abuse you emotionally, but in some cases we have found that they will be kind of condescending a little bit. They'll notice they're distant. That is the devalue stage. They're basically ready to break up with you, but not willing to do it just yet. And then comes stages 5 and 6 of our death wheel, which is the I've decided to actually leave the relationship, and I'm so happy that I left. This is the discard stage. This is where, you know, your usefulness to them has ceased essentially. They've found a new supply, so this is often them going on the rebound. The victim, you, is tormented and feel like you meant nothing to them. And then something kind of interesting happens. Stages 7 and 8 of our death wheel, which is the avoidant feeling kind of lonely and then feeling sorry for themselves. Why can't I ever find the right person? Well, that's stage 4 of the narcissistic abuse cycle. Narcissistic abuse cycle. Say that 5 times. That's the Hoover stage. So this is when they begin to attempt to draw you back into the relationship. This is where you start to see that nostalgia kicking in. It's an almost identical fit, right? With stages 1 and 2, the avoidant falls into the idealized stage. Stages 3 and 4, the devalue stage. Stages 5 and 6, the discard stage. Stages 7 and 8, the Hoover stage. Now, does that mean all avoidant exes are narcissists? No. But I think greater consideration needs to be employed when studying them in tandem with narcissists. It surely seems to me that a lot of avoidants are falling into narcissistic behaviors. I, of course, am just hypothesizing out loud. I've got no proof to back this up other than sort of the aforementioned chart I just threw up for you. But if you want my personal take on the question right now, as it stands, with everything I've ever learned about avoidance and all of that, I think it really revolves around what type of an avoidant you're dealing with. Now, if you aren't familiar, there are two types of avoidance. You have the dismissive avoidant and the fearful avoidant. Now, actually, last week I created this really cool graph to help kind of explain the major differences between the two in a visual medium. I basically described it as a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have very anxious behaviors. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have very avoidant behaviors. So what's interesting is a dismissive avoidant is going to mostly fall into the avoidant behavior categories. The fearful avoidant, on the other hand, is a little bit towards the middle, where half the time they're anxious and half the time they're avoidant. So they're constantly on the spectrum going from one extreme to the next. Now, I actually think as one of our previous coaches that put it best, the biggest difference between a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant is the fact that one has a high self-esteem and one doesn't. It's the fearful avoidant that has the low self-esteem because they have anxious qualities, and those anxious qualities can bring them down. So a dismissive avoidant thinks so highly of themselves that they convince themselves that they don't need to get close to anyone, that they're okay alone. A fearful avoidant, on the other hand, will have these bouts of fear and anxiety, which causes their self-esteem to lower. Now, we know that narcissists in general view themselves as this image of a grandiose person believing that they can do no wrong. Therefore, I actually don't think it's much of a stretch to say that the reason avoidants and narcissists often get paired together is that dismissive avoidants are the individuals who are most likely to exhibit narcissistic traits, because they need to have this insane image of themselves. They need to have this insane confidence to be alone. So what's the through line? I guess my main point with this discussion is to say that when you're trying to understand why exes are coming back when you're happy, I think it has more to do with their own self-image than you. Notice the common trends and threads with everything we've talked about. Avoidant nostalgia. This is a very personal feeling an avoidant holds deep inside. So personal they never usually vocalize it, but they have this nostalgia. They hold on to it. Then there's the Phantom X. They paint you as the Phantom X. It's the way they're viewing you. Narcissistic behavior, this grandiose self-image. The through line is simple. It all has to do with your ex's fragile ego, them potentially not being able to bear you being happy without them. It's about them, not you, which is weird. And it makes sense because we know that in the grand scheme of things, human beings are very self-interested. So if you want to answer the ultimate question, why do exes always seem to be coming back when you're happy? I think the true answer is that they cannot bear being alone without you, or you being happy without them. And it's a weird contradiction, because if they are indeed a dismissive avoidant, they want to be alone. But here's the thing. They want to be alone on their own terms. They don't want to be the ex that is watching you from afar being 10 times happier without them. That hurts their grandiose self-image. And so they need to come back and almost reclaim it